The cabin lights flickered once, then again, and a sharp, metallic chime cut through the air. Too loud, too abrupt, like a warning that came a second too late. A man in the front row half rose from his seat, voice already raised. "What do you mean, we're not cleared?" We were cleared. The plane had been moving, slowly, deliberately. Tires humming against the runway at Chicago O'Hare. Then the engines throttled down. Not a gentle pause, a forced one. Around him, passengers froze mid-motion. Seatbelts halfway clicked. Coffee cups hovering just above tray tables. The sound of power pulling back echoed through the fuselage, low and unsettling, like a breath being held too long. No one yet knew why the flight had stopped, but everyone felt it. In seat 2D near the aisle, Eleanor Brooks sat perfectly still. Her hands folded over a worn leather briefcase that had seen more airports than vacations. She was 62. Her posture was straight, not stiff, the kind learned from decades of choosing calm, because panic never helped. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on nothing in particular, though she was listening to everything. The captain's door, the hurried footsteps, the change in the air pressure that told her this wasn't routine. Across the aisle, a grey-haired man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That's not normal." She nodded once. "Too many flights, too many years." She knew the sound of wrong. A flight attendant moved quickly down the aisle. Smile tight, one hand braced against the overhead bins. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain tall seated," she said. Voice practiced, breath shallow. "We're experiencing a brief delay." Brief. That word landed heavy. Eleanor shifted her gaze toward the front of the cabin. She could see the back of a man's head in seat 1B. Perfectly groomed silver hair, broad shoulders in a tailored navy jacket. Thomas Reed, late 50s, regional real estate developer. The kind of man who spoke in declarative sentences and expected the world to adjust accordingly. He had boarded early, loudly correcting a gate agent's pronunciation of his name, reminding anyone within earshot that he had a connection he could not miss. When the aircraft had stopped, Thomas Reed had smiled. A small one, confident, as if delays happened to other people. "What's going on now?" he said, not asking anyone in particular. The attendant slowed. "Sir, we're waiting for confirmation from operations." Thomas leaned back, crossing his arms. "Well, hurry it up. Some of us have obligations." Eleanor watched the exchange without expression. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window lines at the corners of her eyes, deepened by years of concentration rather than age. She had boarded quietly. No carry-on drama, no status announcements. She had taken the seat printed on her boarding pass and placed her briefcase beneath the seat in front of her exactly where it fit. She had done everything right. Yet even before the aircraft door had closed, she had felt the weight of eyes on her. Not curious, measuring. The look people gave when they were deciding whether you belonged in a place they considered earned territory. A young flight attendant had paused longer than necessary at her row, had asked politely, too politely, "Can I double-check your seat assignment, ma'am?" Eleanor had handed over the pass, watched the woman read it twice, watched the flicker of surprise she tried and failed to hide. That was when Eleanor knew. Something was going to happen. The engines remained silent. Minutes stretched, The quiet grew thick, punctuated by nervous coughs. The rustle of newspapers lowered without being read. A man in the back cleared his throat loudly, irritation disguised as confidence. From the cockpit, a voice crackled over the intercom, clipped controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're going to pause here on the runway for a few moments while we verify a compliance item. Please remain seated." Compliance. That word rippled through the cabin. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Not in fear, in calculation. She had spent her life around systems, complex ones, financial networks, transportation grids, regulatory frameworks built on redundancies and human error. She knew how fragile order actually was, how easily one overlooked detail could halt something massive. That was the paradox. The bigger the machine, the smaller the switch that stopped it. Thomas Reed scoffed. "Unbelievable," he muttered. He leaned toward the aisle, flagging the attendant again. "This is ridiculous. We were already cleared. Someone's messing up." The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. "Sir, I need you to remain seated." Thomas laughed once. "Sharp. This always happens. Someone files something wrong, and the rest of us pay for it." His eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor. Just a glance. Assessing. Dismissive. The kind of look that carried 1,000 unspoken assumptions. Eleanor felt it land. Felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest. Not anger. Recognition. Across the aisle, the grey-haired woman leaned closer to her husband. "That man's going to make it worse," she whispered. Her husband exhaled. Men like that always do. The delay stretched on. 5 minutes. 10. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the auxiliary systems compensated. A low hum vibrated through the floor, subtle but insistent. Eleanor adjusted her grip on the briefcase. Inside were papers she no longer needed to carry, but did anyway. Habits formed when you had once been the only person in the room who understood the stakes, when you had learned never to trust that someone else would protect your work. A memory surfaced uninvited. A conference room in Cleveland decades earlier. Men in suits talking over her, past her until the numbers failed without her input. Until they had turned slowly, realizing too late who had been holding the structure together. The aircraft lurched slightly as ground control adjusted positioning. A ripple of unease moved through the passengers. Someone laughed nervously. Another checked their watch for the 3rd time in a minute. Thomas Reed stood. Not fully, just enough to assert presence. "I need to know how long this is going to take," he said loudly. "I have a meeting in San Jose that doesn't wait for paperwork." The attendant's voice tightened. "Sir, please, sit down." Eleanor opened her eyes. She didn't look at Thomas. She looked at the attendant, at the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw clenched. A woman trying to hold a line that had already begun to bend. Eleanor spoke then, softly, calm. "She asked you to sit." The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. Thomas turned, surprised. His eyes took her in fully for the first time. The grey in her hair. The plain coat. The briefcase. He smiled thin. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." Eleanor met his gaze. Her expression didn't change. "It concerns everyone." For a moment, the cabin went very still. Even the hum seemed to lower as if listening. From the cockpit, another message crackled through. Shorter this time. Tighter. Operations is reviewing. We are not cleared to proceed. Not cleared. Eleanor leaned back into her seat. Her pulse was steady. This was only the beginning. Whatever had been set in motion was already moving through channels most people never saw. Quietly. Methodically. The flight was grounded, and none of them yet understood why. The delay stretched past the point of discomfort and into something heavier, something that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel deliberate. The engines remained silent, not failed, not broken, simply waiting. From the cockpit came muted voices, low and tense, bleeding faintly through the door. A checklist flipped, a switch clicked, then nothing. The absence of sound became its own presence, loud in the way only uncertainty could be. Eleanor Brooks sat with her spine straight, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. She had learned long ago that control was often mistaken for volume. The loudest people in the room rarely understood what was actually happening. They just sensed when the world was no longer bending for them. Thomas Reed sensed it now. He paced the narrow space near the front, hands braced on seat backs, knuckles whitening as he leaned forward. "This is absurd," he said louder than necessary. "If this is about paperwork, it can be fixed on the ground. We don't need to be sitting out here." A man across the aisle cleared his throat. "Sir, maybe let them do their job." Thomas shot him a look. "I am letting them do their job. I'm pointing out they're not doing it very well." The flight attendant returned her expression more brittle than before. "Mr. Reed, I need you to return to your seat." "Give me a time," Thomas demanded. 10 minutes. 20. Something. She hesitated. That hesitation spoke louder than any answer. "We don't have an estimate yet." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Not anger, anxiety. People leaned closer to companions. Fingers drummed armrests. A woman several rows back whispered a prayer under her breath. Eleanor noticed the way the attendant's eyes flicked toward the cockpit, then down the aisle, then briefly, unwillingly toward her. It was a look not of accusation but of unease, as if the attendant sensed a variable she couldn't place. The intercom chimed again. This time the captain's voice carried a strain he hadn't masked. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are working through a verification issue with our departure manifest. Safety regulations require us to resolve it before takeoff. We appreciate your cooperation." Manifest. That word landed differently than compliance. More specific. More procedural. Eleanor exhaled slowly through her nose. Around her, people reacted in small human ways. A retired engineer 2 rows back frowned, already reconstructing systems in his head. A woman with a church bulletin folded neatly in her purse tightened her grip jaw set. Thomas laughed, sharp and incredulous. "Manifest," he repeated. "You're telling me we're sitting here because someone typed a name wrong?" The attendant didn't answer. She couldn't. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting the hem of her coat. Her briefcase remained closed still, as if it were nothing more than leather and brass. No one could see the habit behind it. The reason she never checked it. The reason she never let it out of arm's reach. The man beside her late 60s wire-rim glasses leaned closer. "You think they'll cancel?" Eleanor turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. She said quietly, "They don't cancel for this." "How do you know?" "Because this isn't about weather or mechanics," she replied. "It's about records." He studied her for a beat, surprised by the certainty in her tone. Then he nodded once, as if that made sense. At the front of the cabin, Thomas had taken out his phone. He paced as much as the aisle allowed, thumb jabbing at the screen. "I need to reschedule," he said into it. Voice clipped. "No, I don't know how long. Because they're incompetent. Because they always are." He stopped pacing, turned slightly, eyes landing on Eleanor again. The look lingered this time. Suspicion crept in where dismissal had been. He ended the call abruptly and shoved the phone into his pocket. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "All because someone doesn't understand how things work." Eleanor felt the old echo stir. That phrase. She had heard it in boardrooms, classrooms, court filings. It always meant the same thing. Someone didn't look the way power was supposed to look. The flight attendant returned again, accompanied now by a senior crew member, a man in his early 50s with calm eyes and a practiced steadiness. He spoke quietly to Thomas, voice firm but measured. "Sir, we need you seated." Thomas squared his shoulders. "I'm not causing a scene." "You are the man," said without heat. A beat passed. The tension tightened. Then Thomas huffed and dropped back into his seat, crossing his arms hard enough to wrinkle the fabric of his jacket. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Eleanor's mind moved elsewhere, tracking a different clock. Somewhere beyond the runway, beyond the glass walls and blinking lights, a series of automated checks were unfolding. Flags raised, cross-references performed, names compared, patterns examined, none of it dramatic, none of it fast. That was the point. She had built her career on insisting that systems slow down when humans tried to rush them, on forcing processes to stop when assumptions replaced verification. It had cost her promotions, friends, sleep, but it had saved lives. A chime sounded near the galley. Another attendant whispered urgently into a handset. Her eyes widened slightly. She turned her back, lowering her voice further. The grey-haired woman across the aisle leaned toward Eleanor again. "This feels different," she said softly. Eleanor nodded. "It is." "How?" Eleanor considered her answer. Around them the cabin hummed with restrained fear, the kind older people recognized instantly. Not panic. Awareness. Because when systems pause like this, she said it means someone asked a question that didn't have a quick answer. The woman absorbed that, lips pressing together. "That's never good." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But sometimes it's necessary." At the front, Thomas shifted again, restless. His knee bounced. His confidence had begun to fray threads, pulling loose at the edges. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then down the aisle, searching for someone to blame. His eyes found Eleanor once more. "This wouldn't be happening if everyone stayed in their lane," he said, not quite to her, but close enough. Eleanor met his gaze fully now. Her eyes were steady, dark, unflinching. "Sometimes lanes are the problem," she said. A few heads turned. Someone inhaled sharply. Thomas scoffed, but there was no humor in it. You don't get it. Eleanor held his stare. I do. Silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable, honest. From the cockpit, a new sound emerged. A printer whirring, a page tearing, footsteps approaching the door. The senior crew member straightened, anticipation flickering across his face. The intercom chimed once more. This time there was no attempt to soften the words. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coordinating with operations and ground control. Please remain seated. This process will take as long as required. As long as required. Eleanor leaned back, closing her eyes for just a moment. Not in relief. In resolve. The machine had stopped. The question had been asked. Whatever came next would not be undone by impatience or volume. Around her the passengers waited. Some angry, some afraid, some quietly hopeful, without knowing why. The flight sat motionless on the runway lights, glowing against the night engines, still held in place by a truth that had yet to speak its name. The cockpit door opened without ceremony, just a quiet, hydraulic sigh, but every head in the front half of the cabin lifted at once, not because of who stepped out, because of how he looked. The captain's face was calm, but his eyes weren't. He held a thin stack of papers in one hand, folded too tightly, knuckles pale. He didn't address the cabin. He spoke first to the senior crew member, voice low, clipped, urgent. Whatever he said made the man nod once and swallow hard. Thomas Reed leaned forward in his seat. Finally he muttered, "Someone competent." The captain glanced down the aisle. His gaze moved, deliberately taking in Face's posture, the temperature of the room. He stopped when he reached Eleanor Brooks. Not long. Just long enough. A pause most people missed. Eleanor felt it. Recognition without recognition. The captain turned away and spoke quietly to the flight attendant again. The word hold carried down the aisle. Then verify, then external. The crew dispersed, moving faster now, the choreography no longer relaxed. The cabin changed with them. The air felt tighter, as if the plane itself had leaned forward, listening. Thomas rose halfway from his seat again, unable to help himself. "Captain," he called out, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "Is this really necessary?" The captain stopped, turned, and looked at him fully. His voice was even. "Sir, please remain seated." "That's not an answer," it is the captain said. A few passengers shifted the sound of fabric against fabric, sharp in the quiet. Someone coughed. Another passenger whispered, "Oh boy," under their breath. Eleanor watched Thomas's jaw tighten. He sat back this time, more slowly. His earlier certainty draining into irritation, edged with something else. Fear, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Across the aisle, the grey-haired woman leaned toward Eleanor again. "I don't like this," she said softly. Eleanor nodded. "Neither do they." The woman blinked. "Who?" "The people who thought this would be quick," Eleanor said. From the galley came the sound of a phone ringing. Then another. The senior crew member answered. One turned away, lowered his voice. The flight attendant hovered nearby, hands clasped too tightly, her smile gone entirely now. Minutes passed. Not the kind that slipped by unnoticed, but the kind that sat heavy on the chest. Every second felt accounted for. Thomas pulled out his phone again. No signal. He frowned, thumb tapping the screen harder than necessary. Of course he snapped. Of course now it decides to die. Eleanor glanced at her own phone, still tucked away, silent. She hadn't checked it. She didn't need to. The system didn't announce itself with alerts. It moved quietly, methodically, like water finding every crack. The captain reappeared at the cockpit door, this time holding a headset. He spoke into it briefly, listening more than talking. His shoulders squared, then dropped a fraction the way they did when a decision had been made, but not yet spoken aloud. The intercom chimed. The sound was sharper, now less polite. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, voice steady, but stripped of warmth. "We are coordinating with ground control and our operations center. This aircraft will remain on the runway until further notice." A collective exhale rushed through the cabin. Not relief. Something closer to dread. Thomas laughed again, louder this time. "Unreal," he said. "You hear that?" Further notice. This is what happens when you let systems run everything. Eleanor turned her head slightly. "Systems don't do this on their own," she said. Thomas snapped his gaze to her. "And you're the expert." She met his eyes. "I am." The word landed clean. No challenge, no apology. For a moment, Thomas said nothing. Then he smirked, thin and brittle. "Right," he said. "Everyone's an expert now." The senior crew member stepped between them subtly, a physical barrier that hadn't been there before. "Sir," he said quietly, "I need you to keep your voice down." Thomas stared at him then around the cabin. He could feel it now. The shift, the way people were watching him instead of nodding along, the way irritation had turned inward, searching for the source. He sat back, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. From somewhere near the back, a man spoke up, voice rough with age. "Maybe if we all just let them work." Thomas shot him a look, but didn't respond. Eleanor felt the tension cresting, not breaking. Not yet. She thought of the years she had spent being asked to explain, to soften, to reassure men who mistook dominance for understanding. She had learned when to speak and when to wait. This was a waiting moment. A flight attendant approached her seat, moving with caution as if crossing a line she wasn't sure existed. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Eleanor looked up at her. The woman's eyes were earnest now, afraid. Not of Eleanor, of being wrong. Eleanor reached into her coat and handed it over without comment. The attendant took it with both hands, studying it carefully, lips moving as she read. She looked at the seat number, looked at Eleanor, looked again. Her breath caught. Just slightly. She nodded once, almost to herself, and returned the pass. "Thank you," she said. "Please remain seated." Eleanor inclined her head. The attendant moved quickly toward the cockpit, whispering as she walked. The senior crew member followed his face, drawn tight. The cockpit door closed again, sealing whatever conversation was about to happen inside. The grey-haired woman beside Eleanor whispered, "What did you do?" Eleanor answered honestly, "I didn't move." The woman stared at her, then let out a short, incredulous breath. "Good," she said. The cabin waited. Time stretched thin, then thinner. The hum of auxiliary power felt louder now, vibrating through the soles of shoes, through bone. Thomas bounced his knee again, faster this time. He wiped his palms against his trousers, then checked his watch as if it might argue back. Finally, the cockpit door opened again. The captain stepped out, flanked by the senior crew member. He didn't speak immediately. He looked down the aisle again, slower this time, his gaze landing on Eleanor and staying there. Longer than before. His voice carried when he finally spoke. "Ms. Brooks," he said. The sound of her name moved through the cabin like a dropped glass. Heads turned. Whispers sparked and died. Thomas stiffened. "Yes," Eleanor said, standing smoothly as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The captain nodded once. "Respect, not deference, but close. We need to speak with you in the cockpit." Thomas surged to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Why her?" The captain didn't look at him. "Because she's listed as the reporting party," he said. Reporting party. The phrase settled into the air, heavy with implication. Eleanor stepped into the aisle, her movements unhurried. As she passed Thomas, she paused just long enough to meet his eyes. There was no triumph there, only clarity. "You wanted to know how things work," she said quietly. "This is how." She followed the captain into the cockpit. The door closed behind her, with a final decisive click. The cabin sat in stunned silence. The flight still grounded the truth, inching closer to the surface, ready to break through in ways none of them had prepared for. The cockpit smelled faintly of warm plastic and coffee that had gone untouched for too long, a confined space where every sound carried weight. Eleanor stepped inside and stopped just behind the captain's seat, careful not to cross the invisible boundary without being invited. She had learned long ago that rules mattered most in places where lives depended on them. The captain closed the door and turned his face, set eyes sharp with a focus that came from decades of responsibility. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "thank you for coming forward." "I didn't come forward," Eleanor replied. "You called me." A corner of his mouth twitched almost a smile, but it didn't last. He gestured to the jump seat. "Please." She sat folding her hands in her lap, posture relaxed but alert. The first officer, a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and a braid tucked beneath her cap, glanced back briefly, curiosity flickering before she returned to her screens. The captain held up a printed sheet. "You flagged a discrepancy in the departure manifest." "Yes." That flag triggered a mandatory verification cycle. He continued. "One we don't initiate lightly." "I know." He studied her, weighing something beyond the paper in his hand. "You understand what that does to a flight?" Eleanor nodded. "It stops it." "It does more than that," the first officer said, turning now. "It pulls data from multiple systems, passenger records, ticketing, crew logs. It creates a chain. A chain that can't be rushed," Eleanor said. Silence settled between them. Not hostile, but charged. The captain lowered the paper. "Most people don't know that process exists," he said. "Even fewer know how to trigger it correctly." Eleanor met his gaze. "Most people don't need to." Outside the cockpit, the cabin murmured a distant, restless sound. The captain exhaled slowly. "We have a situation," he said, "and I need to understand why you initiated it." Eleanor's eyes flicked briefly to the door, then back to him. Because the manifest was wrong, she said. And because when manifests are wrong, assumptions usually follow. The first officer frowned. Assumptions about what? About who belongs, where Eleanor replied. The captain leaned back slightly, absorbing that. There was a seating dispute, he said. Those happen. They shouldn't, Eleanor said. A beat passed. The captain's gaze sharpened. You're not wrong, he said. But this response is significant. It had to be, Eleanor replied. Because quieter ones weren't working. He looked at her more closely now, not as a passenger, but as a variable he needed to understand. You could have asked for a supervisor. I did, Eleanor said, indirectly, and when that failed, I escalated through the channel designed for escalation. The captain glanced at the first officer, then back to Eleanor. You're aware this delays everyone? I am, Eleanor said, and I'm aware that inconvenience is not the same as harm. The first officer's eyes softened slightly. She turned back to her instruments, but she was listening. The captain folded the paper and set it down. Operations is asking questions, he said. Ground control wants to know why we're still here. And there's pressure to resolve this quickly. Eleanor nodded. There always is. You're very calm, he observed. I've waited longer than this, Eleanor said. Outside the hum of auxiliary power deepened a reminder that time was passing, whether anyone liked it or not. The captain's voice lowered. Ms. Brooks, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. Do you have any professional relationship with the systems currently reviewing this aircraft? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Not because she was hiding, but because precision mattered. I have worked with similar systems, she said. That's not an answer, the captain said, gently but firmly. Eleanor met his eyes. I helped design the framework that determines when those systems pause, she said. Not this specific aircraft, not this airline, but the logic beneath them. The cockpit fell very quiet. The first officer turned fully in her seat now. You're saying you wrote the rules? I'm saying I argued for them, Eleanor replied. For years. The captain's expression changed not to awe, but to understanding. That explains the precision, he said. It explains the necessity, Eleanor corrected. A sharp knock came at the cockpit door. The senior crew member's voice filtered through. Captain Operations is on line 2. The captain nodded toward the door. One moment. He turned back to Eleanor. You understand what this means if we proceed? I do, Eleanor said. It means someone will have to admit they were wrong. He opened the door and stepped halfway out, speaking in low tones Eleanor couldn't hear. The first officer watched her curiosity, now mixed with something like respect. You don't look like trouble, she said. I'm not, Eleanor replied. I'm consequence. The first officer let out a breath that might have been a laugh, might have been something else. The captain returned, closing the door behind him. His jaw was set. Operations wants this resolved, he said. They're asking if we can clear the discrepancy manually. And you said? I said no, he replied. Because the system doesn't allow shortcuts once it's engaged. Eleanor inclined her head. He studied her again. You realize people out there are looking for someone to blame. I know, Eleanor said. They usually are. The captain's voice softened. You're going to be a very unpopular person for a little while. I've survived that before. Another pause. The captain reached for the intercom handset, then stopped. He looked at Eleanor. What do you want to happen? The question hung between them, heavy and honest. I want the manifest corrected, Eleanor said. I want the seating resolved according to the ticket that was purchased, and I want the crew protected from being forced into bad decisions by louder voices. The first officer nodded slowly. And after that, the captain said. Eleanor looked toward the cockpit window, out at the runway lights stretching into the dark. After that, she said, the plane can fly. The captain considered her words, then picked up the handset. His voice was steady as he spoke into it, relaying instructions, pushing back when challenged, invoking procedures that could not be argued away. Outside the cockpit, the cabin waited. Thomas Reed sat rigid in his seat, jaw-clenched eyes darting toward the door every time it shifted. Around him, passengers watched, listened, recalibrated their judgments. Inside, the captain set the handset down. He met Eleanor's gaze. We're proceeding, he said. This will take time. Eleanor stood smoothly. I'll wait. He nodded once. So will we. As she stepped back toward the door, the first officer spoke softly. For what it's worth, she said. Thank you. Eleanor paused, then looked back. For doing your job, she said. You're welcome. The cockpit door opened. The noise of the cabin rushed back in, heavier now, charged with expectation. Eleanor stepped out into the aisle, the weight of eyes on her shoulders. The flight still grounded the truth, still unfolding, and the cost of standing firm, beginning to reveal itself. When Eleanor stepped back into the cabin, the silence felt heavier than before, dense with expectation and misdirected blame. Every movement slowed, as if the air itself resisted motion. Heads turned. Whispers stalled halfway out of mouths. Thomas Reed watched her approach with narrowed eyes. The certainty he'd carried earlier, now cracked, leaking irritation, and something colder beneath it. He leaned into the aisle as she passed, voice low but sharp. Whatever you think you're doing, he said, you're making this worse. Eleanor didn't stop. She didn't look at him. Her heels touched the carpet, softly, measured, deliberate. She returned to her seat and sat, folding her hands again over the briefcase. The leather creaked faintly, a small sound that somehow cut through the tension. The grey-haired woman across the aisle exhaled slowly. You all right? She whispered. Eleanor nodded once. I will be. The intercom chimed not with the practiced cheer of announcements past, but with restraint. The captain's voice came through controlled, clipped carrying weight without drama. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. We are completing a mandatory verification process. This will take additional time. Please remain seated. Additional time. The words rippled outward, settling uneasily. A man near the window muttered, Figures. Another rubbed his temples, eyes closed. Someone farther back laughed without humor. Every time they said. Thomas shifted in his seat, restless energy radiating off him. He leaned toward the aisle again, unable to keep still. This is unbelievable, he said louder now. One person decides to play hero, and the rest of us are stuck. A few heads turned toward him. Not in agreement. Not anymore. Eleanor felt the shift, subtle but real. The crowd's instinct was recalibrating, searching for the source of disruption. And disruption was loud. It always was. The senior crew member appeared again, standing squarely at the front, hands clasped behind his back. His voice carried just enough to reach the first rows. "Sir," he said to Thomas, "I need you to remain seated and lower your voice." Thomas laughed, sharp and defensive. "You going to throw me off the plane now?" "No," the crew member said evenly. "I'm going to ask you to follow instructions. For how long? For as long as it takes." That landed harder than Thomas expected. He sank back into his seat, jaw-clenched eyes darting again toward Eleanor. The look this time was no longer dismissive. It was searching, calculating. Across the aisle, the grey-haired man with wire-rim glasses leaned toward Eleanor again. "You must have done something important," he said quietly. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. "I did something necessary." The hum of auxiliary power deepened again, vibrating through the floor, a constant reminder that time was still moving, even if the plane was not. Outside the windows, runway lights burned steady against the dark, indifferent to the impatience inside the cabin. Minutes dragged, then more. Not the kind measured by watches, but by discomfort, by the ache in shoulders, by the dryness in throats, by the slow unraveling of confidence. Thomas checked his phone again. Still nothing. He swore under his breath. "This is costing me," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "People like her don't understand that." The grey-haired woman across the aisle stiffened. "People like her," she repeated softly. Her husband placed a hand over hers. "Easy," he murmured, though his eyes stayed on Thomas, hard and unblinking. Eleanor felt the words land, felt the old, familiar weight press down. She didn't turn. She didn't react. She had learned long ago that responding to small cruelties only fed them. What mattered was what happened next. Another chime, this time from the cockpit door opening. The captain stepped out again, followed closely by the senior crew member. The captain didn't address the cabin immediately. He scanned the first rows, eyes moving from face to face until they found Eleanor. He nodded once. A murmur rolled through the cabin. Thomas noticed the look. His stomach tightened. "What's that about?" he snapped, half rising again. The captain turned toward him. Voice firm, final. "Sir, remain seated. You keep saying that Thomas shot back. I want to know why she gets special treatment." He jabbed a finger down the aisle toward Eleanor. The captain's expression hardened. "This is not about special treatment." "Then what is it about?" "It's about procedure," the captain said, "and accountability." The word accountability hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. The senior crew member stepped forward. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, "we're going to ask you to gather your belongings." Thomas froze. "What?" "You're being reseated pending further review." The crew member continued. "Please comply." A ripple of surprise moved through the cabin. A few people inhaled sharply. Someone whispered, "Oh my." Thomas surged to his feet. "This is outrageous," he barked. "You can't do this." The captain didn't raise his voice. "We can," he said. "And we are." Thomas looked around, searching for allies, for nods, for the familiar reinforcement of status. He found none. Just eyes, watching, waiting. Eleanor remained seated, still composed. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The senior crew member waited unflinching. "Sir." Thomas's face flushed. He snatched his jacket from the seat movements, jerky, uncoordinated. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice cracking. "You have no idea who I am." The grey-haired man across the aisle spoke up, voice calm but firm. "We all know who you are now." That did it? Thomas's bravado collapsed inward, folding under the weight of eyes and silence. He shoved his phone into his pocket and followed the crew member toward the front, shoulders hunched, anger curdling into humiliation. As he passed Eleanor, he stopped just for a second. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Eleanor finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "It is," she said. He flinched, then looked away, continuing down the aisle as the cabin watched him go. The captain waited until Thomas disappeared behind the galley curtain. Then he turned back to the passengers. "Thank you," he said simply. "We appreciate your cooperation." No applause followed, just a collective release of breath. The grey-haired woman squeezed Eleanor's arm gently. "About time," she whispered. Eleanor allowed herself a small nod. Minutes later the hum shifted. A different tone. Subtle but unmistakable. The systems were coming back online. Screens flickered, lights steadied. The plane felt alive again. The intercom chimed once more. This time the captain's voice carried something new. Not cheer, not relief. Resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are cleared to proceed. We'll be on our way shortly." A quiet murmur spread, relief tempered by exhaustion. People leaned back, closed their eyes. Unclenched hands they hadn't realized were tight. Eleanor sat still, feeling the weight of the moment settle. The cost, the looks, the unspoken judgments that would follow. She felt tired, bone tired. But beneath it, something steadier held her up. Across the aisle, the grey-haired man leaned toward her one last time. "Worth it," he said. Eleanor looked out the window as the engines began to hum deeper, now stronger. The runway lights blurred slightly as the plane prepared to move. "Yes," she said, quietly. "It always is." The plane rolled forward at last. Slow at first, then steadier, the engines rising into a deep, controlled roar that vibrated through the cabin and into bone. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The movement itself felt like permission to breathe again. Eleanor Brooks kept her eyes on the window as the runway lights slid past, white and yellow streaks dissolving into one another. She felt the familiar pull in her chest as the aircraft accelerated, that moment where gravity tested resolve. She had lived long enough to know that forward motion always came with cost. You didn't get at one without the other. The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. Chicago fell away beneath them, a grid of lights, shrinking into abstraction. Only then did the cabin fully exhale. Seatbelts clicked tighter. A woman 2 rows back whispered, "Thank God." Someone laughed softly, the sound shaky but relieved. The plane climbed steady and sure, and the tension that had ruled the last hour loosened its grip, though it didn't disappear. Not yet. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, smoother now but still firm. "We're airborne and climbing to cruising altitude. Thank you for your patience and cooperation. We appreciate it." Cooperation. Eleanor let the word settle. The senior crew member passed down the aisle, eyes scanning posture, relaxed but alert. When he reached Eleanor's row, he paused just long enough to meet her gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not for patience, not for understanding, for something else." Eleanor inclined her head. "You did your job," she replied. He hesitated, then nodded and moved on. Across the aisle, the grey-haired woman leaned back, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap. Her husband stared out the window, lips pressed together, the ghost of a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Took guts," he said, softly. Not quite to Eleanor, but close enough. Eleanor didn't answer. Praise like blame wasn't the point. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled out. Screens flickered back to life. A flight attendant began the slow, methodical work of resetting the cabin, collecting cups that had never been finished, straightening seat backs that hadn't been reclined. Normalcy reasserted itself in small, deliberate steps. Eleanor reached down and adjusted her briefcase under the seat. The leather was warm now from the heat of the floor. Familiar. Grounding. She felt the ache in her shoulders, the delayed arrival of fatigue once adrenaline released its hold. This was the part no one talked about. The aftermath. Her phone vibrated. Once. She didn't look at it immediately. She knew what it would be. The system always spoke eventually. When she did glance down the screen, showed a single message. Secure channel. No urgency marker. Just confirmation. The process had completed. Records corrected. Flags cleared. A quiet digital acknowledgement that what she had insisted on had been validated. She locked the phone again, without replying. 2 rows ahead, Thomas Reed's seat sat empty. The absence was conspicuous, a gap that drew the eye and held it. People noticed. They always did. But no one commented. The cabin had learned something tonight, even if no one could quite articulate it. A flight attendant approached Eleanor's row, this one younger, her expression cautious but respectful. "Ms. Brooks," she said softly, "can I get you anything?" Eleanor looked up. "Water, please." The woman nodded and moved on. The grey-haired woman watched her go, then leaned toward Eleanor. "You didn't do that for yourself," she said quietly. Eleanor met her eyes. "No, for someone else." "For everyone," Eleanor corrected gently. The woman smiled a small, knowing smile, the kind that came from years of choosing battles carefully. "I wish I'd done that. More," she said. "So do most people," Eleanor replied. The cabin settled into the rhythm of flight, the steady hum, the faint clink of ice, the low murmur of conversations that avoided the obvious circling instead around whether, in San Francisco, grandchildren the price of gas. Life reasserting itself in familiar patterns. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the aircraft carry her. Images flickered behind her lids unbidden. A younger version of herself, standing alone in a conference room. The only woman, the only black face being told to wait her turn. Being told not yet. Being told later. She had waited. She had watched systems fail because they were built on assumptions instead of reality. She opened her eyes again, The window reflected her face back at her older now lines, etched by years of insistence rather than regret. She didn't look powerful. She looked tired, and that felt honest. The captain emerged from the cockpit and moved down the aisle, checking in with the crew. When he reached Eleanor's row, he stopped. The grey-haired couple looked between them, curiosity flickering. "Miss Brooks," the captain said quietly. "May I?" Eleanor nodded. "I wanted you to know," he continued, keeping his voice low. "Operations confirmed everything. The process was executed correctly." "I expected it would be," Eleanor said. He studied her for a moment. "You could have made this harder." "I could have," she agreed. "But you didn't." She met his gaze. "Harder isn't always better." The captain nodded slowly. "Still," he said, "what you did took courage." Eleanor considered that. "It took memory," she said. Courage came later. He accepted that without argument. "If you need anything for the rest of the flight," he said, "please let us know." "I won't," Eleanor replied. He smiled faintly, then moved on. The plane cruised westward. Lights dimmed further as the cabin settled into night mode. Some passengers slept, others pretended to read. A few stared into the dark beyond the windows, lost in thought. Eleanor rested her head back, eyes open, listening to the steady cadence of the engines. Somewhere below, land passed unnoticed. Somewhere ahead, the night waited. She thought of Thomas Reed, wherever he was now. Grounded, angry, certain that this had been done to him. She felt no satisfaction in that. Consequences weren't revenge. They were correction. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered. Not with words, just a brief acknowledgement. Understood. Across the aisle, the grey-haired woman spoke again, barely above a whisper. "My daughter used to tell me to keep my head down," she said. "Said it was safer." Eleanor turned toward her. "Was it?" The woman shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It just took longer to see the damage." Eleanor smiled, small and sad and true. The engines maintained their steady hum as the plane cut through the night, carrying with it a quiet shift that wouldn't make headlines or trend anywhere, but would linger in memory. A recalibration, a reminder. Eleanor closed her eyes at last, not to escape, but to rest. The flight moved forward, unimpeded now, grounded only by the simple fact that someone had refused to move when moving would have been easier. The cabin slept in pieces not all at once, but in fragments stitched together by engine noise and dimmed lights. Eleanor Brooks remained awake. She sat with her seat slightly reclined, hands resting on the armrests, eyes open, watching the faint reflection of herself in the window as the darkness outside swallowed everything else. At this altitude, the world below was reduced to nothing but the idea of land, a presence without detail. It reminded her of how power often worked. You didn't see it. You just felt when it shifted. A few rows ahead, a man snored softly. Somewhere behind her, someone turned a page. The sound crisp in the quiet. The flight had settled into that peculiar middle space where nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything felt changed. Eleanor's phone vibrated again, longer this time. She frowned slightly and reached for it, shielding the screen with her palm out of habit. The message wasn't from operations. It was from a number she hadn't seen in years. She stared at it for a moment before opening it. "Are you on the Chicago to San Francisco flight?" No greeting, no explanation, just the question. Eleanor typed back slowly. "Yes." 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then vanished, then returned. Finally, the reply came. "I'm with the Oversight Review team. We need to speak with you after landing." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Not surprise, recognition. This was the part that always came later, after the immediate problem was solved. When institutions realized they needed to understand how close they had come to failing, she replied with a single word. "Understood." The phone went dark again. Across the aisle, the grey-haired woman shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Her husband reached over automatically, resting a hand on her arm, until she stilled. The tenderness of the gesture made Eleanor's chest tighten unexpectedly. She looked away back toward the window. The engines maintained their steady rhythm, a sound Eleanor knew well. She had sat through hundreds of flights, dozens of delays, countless meetings that stretched long past exhaustion. She had learned that the most important moments rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly disguised as inconvenience. A shadow moved near the galley. The senior crew member spoke softly with another attendant, their voices low, careful not to wake passengers. Eleanor caught fragments. Documentation, report, follow-up. Words that lived in the world of consequence. The younger flight attendant from earlier approached Eleanor's row again, holding a small cup. "Water," she whispered, setting it gently on the tray. "And I brought you a blanket." "Thank you," Eleanor said. The woman hesitated. "I just wanted to say," she began, then stopped, unsure. Eleanor looked up at her. "Say it." The attendant swallowed. "I've been doing this job for 4 years," she said, "and I've never seen anyone handle something like that the way you did." Eleanor considered her words carefully. "You saw me handle it after years of practice," she said. "Not before." The attendant nodded, absorbing that. Still, she said it mattered. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "It did." The attendant moved on, leaving Eleanor alone again with the hum and the dark. Time passed, or maybe it didn't. At cruising altitude hours, blurred together, marked only by subtle changes in cabin lighting and the ache in joints that reminded her she was no longer young. She shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket, feeling the dull throb in her knees. This was another truth no one talked about. Strength aged. Resolve cost more each year. Her mind drifted unbidden to Thomas Reed. She imagined him in the terminal, pacing, calling lawyers, rehearsing explanations that centered himself as the victim. She felt no satisfaction in that image. Only a distant sadness. He would tell this story for years, she knew, and in every version he would be misunderstood, wronged, blindsided. He would never mention the woman he dismissed before the delay began. That omission would be his most honest confession. The captain's voice came softly over the intercom, barely above a whisper. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into San Francisco. Please ensure your seat backs and tray tables are in the upright position." Movement rippled through the cabin as people stirred awake. Seat backs rose. Window shades slid open to reveal a pale glow on the horizon. Morning was coming slow and inevitable. Eleanor straightened, folding the blanket neatly. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with landings, Not fear, but anticipation. Arrival always meant reckoning. As the plane descended, the city emerged beneath them. Lights scattered like constellations, streets tracing patterns she'd memorized over a lifetime. She had built a career here, fought battles she never spoke about, lost more than she admitted. The wheels touched down with a firm, reassuring thud. Applause broke out briefly, polite and reflexive. The engines reversed, roaring, slowing them down. Eleanor felt the jolt travel up through her spine, grounding her fully back into the world. As the plane taxied, the cabin filled with the low buzz of post-flight conversation. People gathered, bags stretched stiff limbs, checked phones. News of the delay had already spread. Text messages blinked. Explanations were drafted. The grey-haired woman leaned toward Eleanor one last time. "I'm glad you were on this flight," she said. Eleanor smiled, tired but genuine. "So am I." When the seatbelt sign finally chimed off the aisle, filled quickly. Eleanor waited unhurried. She always did. Rushing at the end never changed the order of things. As she stood, the senior crew member approached again. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "there are 2 people waiting at the gate for you." "I know," Eleanor replied. He studied her face. "Are you all right?" She considered the question, thought of the fatigue, the attention, the inevitable follow-ups. "I will be," she said. He nodded and stepped aside as she moved into the aisle. The jet bridge smelled of recycled air and coffee. At the end of it stood 2 figures, both in dark jackets, neither smiling. One was younger, tense. The other older, with the watchful calm of someone who had seen too many systems fail to be impressed by appearances. "Ms. Brooks," the older one said. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us." Eleanor adjusted the strap of her briefcase on her shoulder. "You were going to speak with me whether I agreed or not." A flicker of something like respect crossed his face. "Fair," he said. They walked together down the corridor, past travelers eager to move on past advertisements as promising ease and convenience. Eleanor listened as they spoke about review boards and procedural audits, about lessons learned and future safeguards. She answered when necessary, corrected gently when they were wrong. As they reached the terminal, sunlight streamed through the glass walls, bright and unforgiving. Eleanor paused for just a moment, letting it wash over her face. This part she knew would take longer. There would be reports, meetings, subtle resistance dressed up as caution. There always was. But there would also be change, incremental and real, born from the simple act of refusing to move when moving would have been easier. She stepped forward into the light, the noise of the terminal swelling around her, the story of the flight already beginning to harden into memory. Not as a scandal, not as a spectacle, but as a reminder. Somewhere behind her, another plane prepared for departure engines, spooling systems, checking manifests, verified with a little more care than before. The conference room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet, the kind of neutral space designed to make every conversation feel procedural instead of personal. Eleanor Brooks took the chair closest to the window, setting her briefcase at her feet, hands folded loosely in her lap, as if this were any other meeting on any other morning. It wasn't. Across from her sat 3 people she hadn't expected to see together. The older man from the gate, now introduced as Daniel Moore, represented federal oversight. To his right was a woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a tighter smile. Karen Whitfield, legal counsel for the airline. On the far end sat a younger man, nervous fingers tapping a pen against a yellow pad he hadn't written on yet. Daniel cleared his throat. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice." Eleanor nodded. "I was already awake." Karen's smile flickered, then reset. "We want to walk through yesterday's incident, step by step," she said. "There are questions?" "There always are," Eleanor replied. The younger man glanced up, startled, then quickly back down. Daniel leaned forward. "We've confirmed that the manifest discrepancy you flagged was legitimate. The system functioned as designed." He paused. "What we're trying to understand is why it wasn't caught earlier." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Because it rarely is." Karen's pen stopped. "That's a strong statement." "It's an accurate one," Eleanor said. "Systems catch what they're trained to look for. Humans decide what matters enough to train them." The room went quiet. Outside the window, planes taxied in steady lines, white fuselages gleaming under the California sun. Movement without interruption. Order restored, at least on the surface. Daniel exhaled slowly. The crew reported feeling pressured, he said. Time constraints, passenger expectations, a belief that resolving the issue quietly was preferable to escalation. Eleanor met his gaze. Quiet resolutions tend to favor the loudest people in the room. Karen leaned back in her chair. "Are you suggesting intent?" "I'm suggesting habit," Eleanor replied. "Which is harder to fix." The younger man finally spoke, voice tentative. "There's concern," he said, "about how quickly the situation escalated." Eleanor looked at him kindly. "It didn't escalate quickly," she said. "It escalated correctly." Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Karen noticed and stiffened. "We also need to discuss the individual who was removed from the flight," Karen said. "Mr. Reed." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "What about him?" "He's filed a complaint," Karen continued. "Claims he was treated unfairly." Eleanor waited. Karen pressed on. "He alleges reputational damage." Daniel's mouth tightened. "That part isn't relevant." Karen shot him a look. "It may become relevant." Eleanor spoke calmly. "Reputation isn't damaged by consequences," she said. "It's revealed by them." The younger man's pen stopped tapping. Daniel folded his hands. "Ms. Brooks," he said off the record for a moment. Karen opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Daniel continued. "We've been reviewing similar incidents nationwide. Minor disputes that never make it into reports. Situations resolved informally, quietly." He paused. "They form patterns." Eleanor nodded. "They always do." And yesterday Daniel said those patterns intersected with someone who knew how to stop the machine. Eleanor didn't correct him. She didn't confirm it either. Karen leaned forward again. "That's precisely the concern," she said. "One individual shouldn't have that kind of leverage." Eleanor met her eyes. "No individual does," she said. "The leverage belongs to the rules. I just followed them." Silence stretched. Daniel closed the folder in front of him. "There will be a formal review," he said. "Policy recommendations, training adjustments." He looked at Eleanor. "We'd like you involved." Karen's jaw tightened. "As an external consultant? As someone who understands the system?" Daniel replied. Eleanor considered that. She hadn't planned to say yes. She hadn't planned to say no. She thought of the flight attendant's hesitation, the captain's restraint, the passengers who had watched and learned without words. "I'll consider it," she said. Karen exhaled sharply. "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one," Eleanor replied. The meeting ended shortly after polite handshakes exchanged with varying degrees of sincerity. Eleanor left the room alone, the weight of the conversation settling slowly as she walked down the corridor toward the terminal exit. Outside, the noise hit her all at once. Rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, the constant churn of bodies in motion, life resuming at full volume. She stepped into the sunlight, squinting briefly, then relaxed. Her phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't from oversight. It was from her office. They're talking about it already. Internal chatter, some pushback, some support. She typed back, "Let them talk." As she walked toward the parking structure, she spotted a familiar figure near the curb, the flight attendant. Not the senior one. The younger woman who had brought her water. She stood awkwardly, hands clasped in front of her, clearly waiting but unsure whether to approach. Eleanor slowed. The woman noticed her and flushed. "Brooks," she said. "I didn't want to intrude." "You're not," Eleanor replied. The woman took a breath. "I just wanted to say thank you for yesterday." Eleanor studied her face. Tired, earnest, still learning. "What for?" she asked. "For showing us it's okay to stop," the woman said. "Even when everyone wants you to keep moving." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's not always okay," she said. "But it's always necessary to know when." The woman nodded, absorbing that. "They're changing some procedures," she said. "Already?" "Good," Eleanor replied. The woman hesitated, then smiled, small and genuine. "Safe travels," she said. "You too," Eleanor answered. She continued on the structure of the airport, rising around her concrete and glass, reflecting a sky that looked indifferent to human conflict. As she reached her car, Eleanor paused, resting a hand on the door, feeling the fatigue finally settle deep into her bones. She thought of how close the system had come to doing what it always did. Smooth things over. Push forward. Pretend nothing was wrong. Instead, it had paused. That pause would ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. Policy memos, training modules, quiet resistance, quieter change. Eleanor got into her car and closed the door, shutting out the noise. For a moment, she sat there, eyes closed, breathing in the stillness. Then she started the engine and drove away, carrying with her the knowledge that the hardest part was never stopping a machine. It was living with what happened after it started moving again. The story didn't explode the way scandals usually did. It didn't scream. It seeped. By the time Eleanor Brooks reached her office 2 days later, the incident had already been stripped of its immediacy and repackaged into something safer. A delay, a procedural review, a passenger dispute resolved. The language was careful padded, designed to dull edges. That was how institutions survived. They sanded down the moments that threatened to cut too deep. Eleanor moved through the glass lobby of her building, without stopping, nodding once to the security guard, who had known her for years, and still sometimes looked surprised when she spoke with authority. The elevator ride up was quiet, the kind of quiet that let thoughts wander where they wanted. Inside her office, the morning light slanted across shelves of binders and framed patents catching dust motes mid-air. She set her briefcase down and loosened the scarf at her neck, the small ritual grounding her before the day began. Her assistant Mark appeared in the doorway a moment later, tablet tucked under his arm, expression carefully neutral. "You've got messages," he said. "A lot of them." "I assumed," Eleanor replied. "Some supportive," Mark continued. "Some not." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That tracks." He hesitated. "There's one you should see." She took the tablet and scanned the message, her brow furrowing slightly. It was from a trade association she'd worked with for decades. Polite, concerned, suggesting that while her actions were technically within protocol, the optics had raised questions about discretion, about precedent, about whether encouraging such interventions might create instability. Eleanor handed the tablet back. "They're afraid," she said. "Of what?" "Of losing control of the narrative," Eleanor replied, "and of who's allowed to interrupt it." Mark nodded slowly. "There's also this." He slid a printed article across her desk. Not from a major outlet, a regional paper. The headline was understated, almost dull. "Flight delay prompts internal review of passenger handling procedures." Eleanor read it once, then again. Her name wasn't mentioned. Neither was Thomas Reed's, but the subtext was there, woven between lines like a quiet indictment. "They'll never say it was about bias," Mark said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "They'll say it was about process. And is that enough?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. She thought of the flight attendant's hesitation, of the captain's careful restraint, of the way the cabin had shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, when certainty cracked. "It's a start," she said. Across the city, Thomas Reed sat in a very different kind of quiet. His office, once loud with phone calls and movement, now felt cavernous, emptied of momentum. He stared at his computer screen, refreshing an email inbox that remained stubbornly blank. His assistant had called in sick. Or maybe she just hadn't come in. It was hard to tell anymore. The delay had cost him more than time. That had become clear within hours. A partner had texted, then another. Vague messages. "Let's talk next week. Need to reassess. Concerns from the board." He told the story the only way he knew how. As an ambush, as overreach, as a system turned against him by someone who knew how to pull strings. He left out the part where he'd laughed, where he'd pointed, where he'd assumed. The version didn't land the way he expected. By the end of the week, a compliance inquiry had been opened. Not about the flight, about his firm, about patterns, about behavior that had been tolerated because it came wrapped in profit. The delay had drawn a line no one had bothered to examine before. Now that it was there, people were stepping over it, tracing it backward, asking why it had been allowed to exist at all. Thomas sat back in his chair, hands gripping the armrests. The certainty that had once insulated him, now gone. He felt exposed, not because he had lost something, but because he had never realized how little had been holding him up. Back in Eleanor's office, the oversight team arrived mid-afternoon. Daniel Moore led them, his expression tired but focused. They spread documents across the conference table, diagrams and timelines mapping the incident into something legible and manageable. "We're recommending changes," Daniel said. "Training modules, clearer escalation paths, documentation requirements." Eleanor listened, nodding occasionally, asking questions that cut to the foundation rather than the surface. "And accountability," she said. Daniel met her gaze. "Yes," he said. "That too." Karen Whitfield wasn't there. Eleanor noticed. She didn't comment. When the meeting ended, Daniel lingered. "There's pushback," he admitted. "There always is," Eleanor said. "But there's also momentum." Eleanor stood walking to the window, looking out at the city she'd spent decades shaping from the margins inward. "Momentum is fragile," she said. "It needs reinforcement." Daniel nodded. "We were hoping you'd say that." That evening, Eleanor went home alone, the city's lights flickering on as dusk settled. She cooked something simple, ate at the counter, and turned on the radio more out of habit than interest. A familiar voice drifted through the room, discussing transportation safety, regulatory oversight, the importance of procedural integrity. She turned it off. Later, she sat by the window, tea cooling in her hands, and let the quiet return. The fatigue she'd been holding at bay finally surfaced heavy and insistent. She welcomed it. Exhaustion meant something had been spent for a reason. Her phone buzzed once more, a message from the young flight attendant. They implemented the new check today. Took longer. People complained. But it worked. Eleanor typed back, "Good." She set the phone down and closed her eyes, thinking of the passengers on that flight, each carrying their own version of the delay home with them. Some would forget it. Some would retell it, reshaping it, to fit old beliefs. A few would remember the feeling of the plane not moving, the uncomfortable realization that something had to be addressed before anything could proceed. That was enough. Change didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pauses, in moments where forward motion was denied until something unresolved was faced. Eleanor had built her life around recognizing those moments, around refusing to smooth them over. Outside, traffic hummed. Somewhere, another plane prepared for departure. Checklists completed. Manifests verified with slightly more care than before. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked out at the city, feeling neither victorious nor defeated. Just present. The machine was moving again, altered in ways most people would never notice. That was how real change worked. Morning arrived without ceremony, the way it always did, after something had shifted quietly in the dark. Eleanor Brooks stood at the edge of the bay coat, pulled tight against the cool air, watching the water move in steady, unhurried rhythms. The city behind her was already awake, traffic beginning its low, persistent hum. But out here, the world still felt paused, as if it were waiting to see what would come next. The days after the flight had filled themselves with meetings, memos, carefully worded calls. She had participated where necessary, corrected where it mattered, declined where symbolism threatened to replace substance. By the end of the week, the incident had become a case study, stripped of faces and emotion, reduced to bullet points and procedural language. That was how systems learned. Slowly. Indirectly. Often without acknowledging the people who forced them to. Eleanor didn't need acknowledgement. She had stopped needing that years ago. What mattered was the change she could feel settling in, subtle but real. the kind that didn't announce itself with headlines or applause, but showed up in hesitation where there had once been certainty, in extra steps taken where shortcuts used to live. She thought of the young flight attendant, standing straighter now, eyes more alert. Of the captain voice, steady choosing process over pressure. Of the passengers who had sat in silence and watched a loud man lose the room without anyone raising their voice. Those images stayed with her more vivid than any report. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She didn't look at it immediately. She had learned the value of letting things wait. When she did glance down, it was a message from Daniel Moore. The recommendations are moving forward. Not all of them. Enough to matter. Eleanor typed back a brief reply. That's how it starts. She slipped the phone away and returned her gaze to the water. Gulls traced lazy arcs overhead, indifferent to human systems and the small dramas that played out beneath them. She envied that sometimes the simplicity of instinct. Then she remembered how much she had built, how much she had endured to make room for instinct to coexist with responsibility. Across the country, Thomas Reed sat alone in a quiet office that no longer felt like a command center. He had spent days trying to frame what happened into something that preserved his sense of himself. He told friends it was an overreaction, told colleagues it was bad luck, told himself it was unfair. But in the stillness of early mornings, when there was no one to perform for a different truth pressed in, he had assumed the world would move aside. When it hadn't, he had no language for that failure except blame. That realization would not redeem him. It might not even change him, but it would follow him a low hum beneath his certainty, reminding him that comfort was not the same as entitlement, and that some systems no longer bent as easily as they once had. Eleanor didn't think about him often. She didn't need to. The story was larger than any single person. That had always been the point. Later that afternoon, she returned to her office and stood for a moment before the window city, stretching out below like a living map of ambition and compromise. She remembered arriving here decades earlier, underestimated, unheard, carrying ideas no one wanted to slow down enough to understand. She remembered learning that patience could be sharpened into resolve, that silence could become leverage when paired with preparation. Her assistant knocked lightly and stepped in. "They've approved the pilot program," he said. "Training revisions, new escalation language." Eleanor nodded. "Good. There's resistance," he added. "There always is," she said again without irritation. "That's how you know it's real." When the day wound down, she left the building without fanfare, blending into the evening crowd. On the sidewalk, a woman bumped into her, apologized quickly, and moved on. A small exchange. Ordinary. Eleanor smiled to herself. Dignity lived in those moments too, in the way people corrected course without needing to be told. That night, as the city quieted, Eleanor sat by her window and watched lights blink on and off across the skyline. She thought about the plane suspended on the runway engines, silent, everyone forced to sit with discomfort they would have preferred to outrun. She thought about how rare that was, how necessary. The world taught people to keep moving, to smooth things over, to trade justice for convenience. It rewarded those who filled silence with noise and punished those who asked for time. But every so often, someone refused to move. Someone insisted on the pause. And in that pause, something essential became visible. Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet she had earned. She knew tomorrow would bring more work, more resistance, more moments where standing firm would cost her comfort. She also knew she would do it anyway, not because she wanted to be remembered, but because she wanted the next person to encounter the system, to feel a little less alone. The flight had landed. The machine was moving again. But it was moving differently now, calibrated by a moment of stillness that could not be undone. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of being told to move along when standing still was the right thing to do, take a moment to like the story, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts by commenting 3 words: stand your ground.